April 16, 1945. The thunder of Soviet artillery shook the ground on the outskirts of a German town west of the Elbe. A former schoolhouse, its windows shattered and roof half caved in, had been converted into a field hospital. Inside, the air stank of antiseptic, mingled with blood and smoke. Candle stubs flickered against cracked plaster walls. German nurses moved quickly, but without the sharp energy of the early war years. They were thin, hollow-eyed from weeks without proper rations. Their hands trembled from exhaustion as they bent over rows of cots where soldiers groaned, some already beyond saving. Supplies had dwindled to nothing. Bandages were torn from sheets. Morphine had been reduced to crumbs, carefully measured drop by drop. A pan of boiled water stood in place of sterile instruments. One young nurse whispered as she pressed a cloth against a soldier's chest wound, "If he makes it through the night, it will be a miracle." Her colleague, shaking her head, answered only, "We have no miracles left." The miracle came from outside. As the rumble of tank treads and the distant bark of American rifles echoed through the streets, the first medics of the U.S. Army's 2nd Armored Division entered the building. They wore the Red Cross armband, carrying olive drab packs that seemed impossibly full compared to the empty cupboards around them. German nurses froze, unsure whether to flee, salute, or collapse where they stood. An American sergeant, his voice steady despite the chaos, set down his kit. "We're here for the wounded. All of them." What happened in the next hours was unlike anything the German women had ever witnessed. Out came vials of penicillin, a word they had only read in scarce medical journals before the Reich cut them off from Allied science. Syringes gleamed under the dim light. Portable plasma units, sealed, sterile, ready for transfusion, were hung above beds with practiced speed. A medic threaded an intravenous line, clear liquid dripping into a soldier who had been hours from death. The German nurses watched in disbelief. Men who had been left to fate, feverish, fading, whispering final prayers, began to stabilize. Shallow breathing deepened. Color returned to waxen faces. Infected wounds that smelled of rot were flushed clean, stitched, and treated with powders the women did not recognize. One nurse murmured, almost to herself, "This is not medicine. This is something else." Her words carried not resentment, but awe. For years they had carried the burden of improvisation, of sacrificing one patient to save another, of writing death into every shift. Now, before their eyes, American medics performed rescues that defied all they had come to expect. The clash was not of weapons, but of worlds. Outside, the Reich staggered toward collapse. Inside, science, resources, and organization gave life, where once there had only been resignation. The German nurses slowly began to assist. At first reluctantly, then with growing urgency, they held patients steady, translated cries of pain, handed over instruments. The room, once a place of despair, now hummed with a new rhythm, not of inevitability, but of survival. In the corner, a girl of barely 20 wiped blood from her hands and whispered to her patient, "Hold on, they can save you now." For the women who had carried the dying through 6 years of war, this moment felt like stepping from darkness into light. Not a victory for the Reich, nor for the Allies, but for the stubborn insistence that even in ruins, life could still be preserved. This was Berlin's world in miniature, a city collapsing above. Yet inside its basements and wards, enemies worked shoulder to shoulder, bound not by ideology, but by the desperate need to keep men alive. To understand the astonishment of 1945, one must first look back to the long years that came before. In Nazi Germany, the profession of nursing was shaped not only by medicine, but by ideology. Women were expected to embody service, obedience, and sacrifice, the very traits that the Reich sought to glorify in propaganda. Posters showed smiling Red Cross nurses bandaging soldiers with calm devotion, their uniforms pressed, their hair neat beneath starched caps. Reality was far harsher. German nursing was divided across organizations. The German Red Cross provided the largest contingent, while the Kriegskrankenhelferinnen, the war hospital helpers, were drafted in staggering numbers to tend to the endless streams of wounded. In the SS system, nurses were stationed in both military hospitals and concentration camps, their duties blurred by political loyalty. Training schools drilled discipline as much as anatomy. Lessons emphasized hierarchy. Nurses obeyed doctors, doctors obeyed officers, and all served the Reich. The war quickly shattered these illusions. By 1942, casualty lists from the Eastern Front poured in by the thousands. Trains unloaded carriages of broken men at makeshift hospitals in Germany and occupied Europe. The women tasked with saving them faced shortages so severe that modern medicine became an unattainable dream. Penicillin, the miracle drug that Allied armies distributed freely, never reached German wards. The Reich's laboratories had failed to mass-produce it, leaving infections to spread unchecked. A simple shrapnel wound often turned septic within days, the patient's fever climbing as nurses looked on, powerless. Instead of antibiotics, German staff relied on sulfa powders that dulled symptoms but rarely cured. Blood transfusions, too, were rationed. Mobile blood banks were virtually non-existent. Nurses were trained to use direct transfusions, arm to arm, with crude tubing. But donors were scarce, and equipment was primitive. In diaries later recovered, one Red Cross nurse wrote, "We decide who receives blood and who does not. It is not medicine. It is gambling with lives." Improvisation became the hallmark of their work. When morphine ran dry, nurses mixed diluted alcohol to dull pain. When sterile dressings disappeared, they cut strips from sheets and boiled them for reuse. Hospital kitchens doubled as operating theaters, the stench of soup and gangrene mingling in the air. These conditions exacted a personal cost. Malnutrition spread among staff as rations dwindled. Many women continued double shifts despite tuberculosis or exhaustion. Some collapsed beside their patients. Yet they carried on, believing that endurance itself was service to the fatherland. Here lay the paradox of German nursing under the Reich. On one hand, women were celebrated as the silent heroines of the home front, their photographs pinned to propaganda boards, their image used to inspire loyalty. On the other, their daily work resembled a regression to medicine centuries past, where faith and improvisation were the only defenses against death. For the nurses themselves, the contradiction was clear. They were told they served a modern, invincible Reich, yet their wards echoed with the groans of men who died not from bullets, but from infections that the Allies were already curing. This was the world they carried into 1945, a world of shortages, sacrifice, and silence. When American medics arrived with penicillin vials, plasma packs, and surgical kits, it was not only medicine that crossed the threshold. It was the collision of two realities, one where science had advanced, and another where ideology had left its healers stranded in a medieval past. Across the Atlantic, a different war unfolded, one waged in laboratories, classrooms, and mobile hospitals. By 1942, the United States had committed unprecedented resources to medical science, transforming the way soldiers lived and died on the battlefield. In offices at the War Department and research wings at companies like Pfizer, priorities were clear. No wounded man should be abandoned to infections or blood loss if science could intervene. By 1944, American medics carried with them tools that German nurses had only read about in medical journals years earlier. Penicillin, mass-produced for the first time in history, became the Allies' silent weapon. Where German wards watched helplessly as septicemia claimed men within days, American field hospitals stabilized such cases within hours. A medic could kneel beside a soldier, draw a vial from his kit, and inject salvation directly into the bloodstream. In the eyes of German nurses who later witnessed it, this seemed less like medicine than a miracle. Blood plasma represented another revolution. While Germany rationed direct transfusions with tubes and scarce donors, the U.S. Army had perfected large-scale plasma collection, storage, and shipment. Boxes of dried plasma traveled across the Atlantic, reconstituted on the spot to replace lost blood volume. This innovation alone slashed mortality from shock and hemorrhage. The mobility of American medicine proved equally transformative. Portable surgical units, precursors of the later MASH concept, unfolded within hours behind the front. Tents became operating rooms, stocked with sterilized instruments, anesthesia machines, and even X-ray equipment. Army nurses, trained not only in bedside care but in trauma medicine, worked shoulder to shoulder with surgeons to ensure the golden hour was not wasted. If a soldier reached them alive, his chances of survival rose dramatically. For German nurses accustomed to working with boiled rags and alcohol disinfectants, the efficiency of this system would appear as though modern science itself had crossed the front lines. They had been trained to improvise endlessly, while their American counterparts were supplied, prepared, and reinforced by an industrial machine that placed medicine alongside tanks and bombers in priority. Yet within this story of innovation lay a paradox. The same war that destroyed cities also accelerated advances in human survival. Every new weapon unleashed greater casualties, and yet every medical breakthrough kept thousands from death. In the rubble of Normandy and the Ardennes, amidst the howling of artillery, lives were being pulled back from the brink with a precision that Germany could not match. Personal testimonies from U.S. Army nurses reveal the ethos that drove them. One recorded in her diary, "We have no luxury of time. Every wound is a race. If we win the race, the man will live to see another dawn." This relentless drive gave Allied forces not only a military edge, but also a moral one. Soldiers fought knowing that if they fell, a system existed to bring them home alive. For German nurses, witnessing these practices in 1945 was a revelation that bordered on humiliation. The Reich had promised them supremacy in every field. Yet here, in the field of healing, they saw themselves decades behind. As one recalled after the war, "It was not their guns that stunned us. It was their medicine. Where we buried the dying, they healed them." This chapter sets the stage for their first direct encounters in captured German hospitals, where two worlds, one of scarcity and one of abundance, one of improvisation and one of innovation, collided in the most unlikely of places: the fight for human life amidst the ashes of war. In the winter of 1944, as the Allied advance cut deeper into Germany, battles shifted swiftly across towns and villages. Yet, behind the shattered fronts, another kind of encounter unfolded. Not in trenches or streets, but in the wards of field hospitals. When the U.S. Army arrived at captured German medical stations, they did not always dismiss the women in white coats and Red Cross armbands. Instead, they pressed them into continued service, under new orders, under new eyes, and under a flag they had once been taught to despise. The first hours were uneasy. German nurses, trained to salute Reich officers, now found themselves following the curt instructions of American medics. Language fractured every exchange, forcing gestures, pointing, and the occasional broken word of English or German. But urgency was a universal language. A soldier screaming in agony, a chest wound gushing blood. These cut through ideology and demanded action. An American medic set down a glass vial. "Penicillin," he explained slowly, tapping the label. The German nurse beside him frowned, unsure she had heard correctly. The word had floated through rumor, but here it was. Liquid. Measured. injected. Days later, men she would have consigned to death were sitting up in their cots, fever broken, wounds knitting. She wrote in her diary, "We called it a miracle, but for them, it was procedure." Side by side, the work continued. Plasma transfusions were prepared with precision. American nurses instructing their German counterparts on the steps. Open the sterile kit, attach the tubing, monitor the flow. One German recalled the humiliation. "I had studied for years, improvised endlessly, and yet I was being shown how to save lives by women scarcely older than me, with equipment we had never touched." But beneath the sting, there was also awe. The atmosphere in these mixed hospitals carried tension, suspicion, and occasional hostility. Some German nurses whispered resentments, ashamed to be serving under their conquerors. Others, exhausted beyond politics, welcomed the structure and supplies. For many, it was the first time in years that patients lived rather than slipped quietly into death. One American sergeant noted in a letter home, "The women look at us strangely. I can't tell if it's hatred or relief. Maybe both." There were small human moments that pierced through mistrust. A German nurse, trembling as she held a syringe, was steadied by an American counterpart who placed her hand gently on hers. A wounded man, barely conscious, whispered his thanks in German. The American did not understand, but the nurse translated softly, tears catching in her eyes. In those fleeting exchanges, the war outside seemed momentarily suspended, and yet the contrast was impossible to ignore. German women who had for years sterilized scalpels over open flames now watched portable autoclaves hiss and steam. Where they had tied wounds with torn sheets, Americans handed them rolls of factory-made bandages. In the silence of night, some confessed to one another that they felt both humiliated and grateful. Humiliated to see how far behind they had fallen. Grateful that men they once wrote off as doomed were living to breathe another day. This cooperation was fragile, temporary, and bound by necessity. The nurses were not equals. They were supervised, monitored, and sometimes distrusted. Yet within those walls, where blood and cries overpowered ideology, there was an undeniable paradox. Enemies bound together not by allegiance, but by the shared duty to heal. When the war ended, many of these women carried with them memories less of uniforms and ranks, and more of a moment when medicine had broken down the barriers of enmity. In the ruins of Germany, they had glimpsed what healing could mean when practiced with resources, science, and, above all, humanity. The battlefronts shifted, but inside the hospitals the war took on a different face. Amid the ruins of Berlin and across collapsing Germany, the paradox of war became most visible not in gunfire, but in the slow rhythm of medical work. German nurses who only months earlier had tended to SS officers now bent over the wounds of ordinary civilians, operating under American supervision. Their starched armbands and disciplined gestures were the same, but the authority they once answered to was gone. American nurses, moving swiftly through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and dust, treated German prisoners and civilians with the same professionalism they extended to their own. There was no distinction in the way a bandage was tied or morphine administered. Yet beneath the surface, emotions surged. German women scribbled in diaries, stunned by the abundance of supplies. Boxes of clean dressings stacked high, antibiotics flowing freely, vials of morphine delivered as if from an endless source. For those who had learned to scrape by with rags and boiled water, it was almost incomprehensible. One nurse whispered to another, her voice heavy with disbelief, "If we had had even a fraction of this, how many lives might we have saved?" The words hung in the air, unanswerable. Infections that had once doomed soldiers now faded within days. Men too weak to lift their heads sat up, asking for food. The sense of relief was matched only by the ache of hindsight. For every patient now recovering, countless comrades had already been buried because such medicine had been denied to them. The paradox cut deeper with every day. A German woman who had once cleaned wounds for men in black SS uniforms now wiped the forehead of a civilian boy crushed beneath falling masonry. She no longer worked for the Reich. She worked under the direction of men she had been taught were the enemy. Some felt humiliation, others quiet gratitude, and many both at once. In one ward, an American nurse steadied the arm of a wounded German prisoner as plasma flowed into his veins. A German nurse stood nearby, translating his murmured words of confusion. "He does not understand why you would do this for him," she explained. The American simply replied, "Because he's alive." That single sentence, spare, factual, but deeply human, revealed the strange moral terrain of war's end. The hospitals became spaces of contradiction. Outside, artillery still thundered, and surrender negotiations faltered. Inside, silence was broken only by coughs, footsteps, and the clink of medical instruments. In those moments, enemies ceased to be symbols. They became bodies to be mended, voices to be calmed, hands to be held. For the German nurses, this was both revelation and torment, a recognition of what could have been possible if medicine had not been sacrificed to ideology and scarcity. Witnesses wrote of their astonishment. A Red Cross helper recorded in her journal, "It was not victory I saw, but possibility. I realized the war had stolen not just lives, but years of healing we might have given." For her, the abundance of supplies was not simply a gift. It was a reminder of what had been lost in deprivation. In these wards, the paradox of care crystallized. While men outside fought to the death in shattered streets, within hospital walls, compassion blurred the lines of allegiance. German and American women alike stood over the wounded, their hands red with the same blood, their eyes heavy with the same exhaustion. They healed the enemy, they healed their own, and in doing so revealed the strange truth of humanity in war, that even amid hatred and destruction, there remained an instinct to preserve life, however fleeting. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, Germany was a graveyard of rubble and silence. Cities smoldered, families searched among ruins for scraps of survival, and those who had served in the hospitals returned to lives no less broken than the walls around them. For German nurses, the end of the war did not bring celebration. It brought suspicion, silence, and the heavy weight of memory. In the United States, medics and nurses were welcomed home as heroes. Their innovations with penicillin, blood plasma, and mobile surgery became symbols of triumph, not just in war, but in science. They appeared in newsreels, decorated in parades, their names etched into the narrative of victory. By contrast, in Germany, their counterparts melted back into obscurity. A woman who had once pulled men from the edge of death under American supervision now stood in line for bread, careful not to speak too loudly of where she had been or what she had seen. Many faced accusations of complicity. To some, a Red Cross armband looked too close to collaboration with the regime. To others, their silence during the Reich years marked them as indifferent. Few wanted to hear of the paradox they had lived through, of healing in the midst of destruction, of compassion exchanged across battle lines. The ruins of their homeland swallowed their stories whole, yet fragments endured. In diaries, scrawled between ration stamps and lists of missing relatives, nurses recorded astonishment at penicillin, how infection vanished in days, how the dying returned to life. One remembered whispering, "It was like watching a man step back from the grave." Others described the shame of realizing how many had perished for want of supplies that existed just beyond reach. These private words carried truths too raw for public telling, preserved in silence until historians uncovered them decades later. Some women quietly carried what they had learned into new lives. Those who returned to nursing or medicine did so with determination to build something better than the chaos they had endured. In West Germany, hospitals modernized slowly, shaped in part by knowledge gleaned in those tense, humbling days beside American medics. In East Germany, ideology dictated silence, but memory lingered, hidden in family conversations and guarded recollections. And yet, trauma weighed as heavily as knowledge. Many never spoke of the war at all. They carried images they could not erase. The sound of morphine vials clicking against one another, the sight of plasma running clear into veins that once seemed lifeless, the clash of compassion and humiliation. Some lived to see their grandchildren taught a history that had no place for them. In this forgetting lay another paradox. Women who had fought their own battle against infection, against starvation, against despair, were erased from official memory. They had no medals, no recognition, no place in the grand story of victory or defeat. Their legacy lived instead in fragments, in memoirs published late in life, in faded photographs of field wards, in testimonies recorded by oral historians half a century later. The silence of these women tells its own story, a story of how war reshapes memory, how survival can be a quiet act of resistance, and how lessons of compassion and science can be buried as easily as ruins beneath new foundations. Their witness reminds us of what was lost, not only lives, but the chance to acknowledge the strange humanity that emerged in the darkest hours. For German nurses, the aftermath was not a return to normalcy, but an existence between memory and silence. A life lived carrying the paradox of care in war, largely forgotten, yet never erased. In 1945, when the guns had quieted, but the smoke still lingered over ruined cities, a different kind of war revealed itself. One not fought with tanks or artillery, but with bandages, plasma, and hands that healed instead of destroyed. For German nurses who had spent years watching young men slip away, the sudden sight of American medicine was both a revelation and a wound. They had lived in scarcity, improvising with rags and boiling water. Now they watched penicillin erase infection in days, plasma restore men on the brink of death, and morphine silence screams that had once echoed endlessly in their wards. It was not only the science that left them stunned, but the irony. The same enemy they had been ordered to resist was saving lives with precision and compassion. Soldiers the Reich had all but abandoned, too weak, too wounded, too costly to treat, were given another chance by American medics. In the eyes of German nurses, this carried a paradox sharper than defeat. That care itself had become a weapon, one wielded not to kill, but to preserve. One young nurse later recalled standing motionless as an American hung a bag of plasma above a soldier's bed. She had seen countless men fade away, their breath slowing, their eyes dimming. Yet here, in a captured hospital, she witnessed color return to a man's face as life trickled back drop by drop. She did not speak, she only watched, and in her silence was recognition, not of victory or surrender, but of something beyond ideology. For the Americans, it was duty. Their medics had been trained to save any life that could be saved, whether friend or foe. For the Germans, it was an awakening, a realization that healing could outlast the Reich, that knowledge and compassion belonged to no flag. In the years that followed, many of these stories were buried. Diaries locked in drawers, testimonies whispered decades later, fragments preserved only by chance. Yet they carry a profound truth, that even in humanity's darkest hours, moments of light emerged, not from the clash of armies, but from the quiet defiance of care. The ruins of Berlin, Munich, and Dresden held the scars of devastation. But within those ruins, in the sterile glow of Allied medical wards, another legacy was written. It was not the legacy of triumphal parades or grand memorials. It was the legacy of endurance, of recognition, and of knowledge that crossed enemy lines. The final image lingers. A young German nurse standing among the rubble. Her uniform torn, her hands stained by years of desperation. She looks not at flags or speeches, but at a bag of plasma swinging gently above a soldier's bed. In that moment, she sees not just healing, but the future. A reminder that compassion, once learned, cannot easily be forgotten. Their war ended not in glory, but in endurance, and their echoes remind us that amidst destruction, the act of saving life may be the only victory that truly endures.